He didn't even notice I was breaking. I think that's the part that stays with you long after the actual cracks have been sealed over with gold, as they say. It's not the breaking itself. It's the profound, echoing silence that accompanies it. It's the sound of your world splintering, a sound you are sure is deafening, only to look up and see everyone going about their business, as if the universe hasn't just come undone. For me, that business was my father, and the splintering was so slow, so quiet. It took me 2 decades to even hear it myself. But before I can tell you about the breaking, I need to tell you about the before. The time when I still believed in the possibility of being seen, when I hadn't yet learned that some people move through the world with their eyes perpetually focused on a distant horizon, unable to adjust their gaze to the small, precious things right in front of them. I was 4 years old when I built my first masterpiece. I remember this not because 4-year-olds typically have clear memories. Most of early childhood is a blur of sensory impressions and emotional echoes, but because I have photographic evidence. There's a picture, slightly out of focus, taken by my mother before she left, of me sitting cross-legged on our living room carpet, surrounded by an explosion of primary, colored Lego bricks. In the photo, I'm holding up a structure, calling it a castle. Would be generous, it was more of a lumpy tower with asymmetrical walls, but my face is radiant with pride. My eyes are squeezed nearly shut from the width of my smile, my baby teeth on full display, my hair in 2 lopsided pigtails that my father had attempted that morning. What the photo doesn't show is what happened in the moment after the shutter clicked. My mother set down the camera and knelt beside me, her perfume, something floral and expensive that I later learned was Chanel, washing over me. She took my small creation in her hands, turning it carefully, examining it from every angle as if it were a sculpture at a gallery opening. "Do you see this?" she said, pointing to where I'd accidentally created a sort of bridge between 2 towers. "This is brilliant. You've made a covered walkway. That's where the princess would walk when it's raining, so she doesn't get wet on her way to the throne room." She traced her finger along the Lego path, and I watched mesmerized as my accidental architectural feature became intentional, became meaningful, became asterisk seen asterisk. "And here," she continued, touching a red brick I'd placed at an odd angle, "this is clearly a flag, isn't it? Every castle needs to fly its colors." It wasn't a flag I'd just run out of the right-sized bricks, but the moment she named it, it transformed. She had the magical ability to enter my world, to speak its language, to make me feel like my imagination wasn't just valid, but valuable. That's what I lost when she left 6 months later. Not just a mother, but a witness. The person who could see not just the generic category of child's play, but the specific architecture of my particular mind. My father tried, in his way, after she moved out, to find herself, which I later understood meant to escape the suffocation of a life that had become too small for her. He did his best. He learned to make my favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes with the chips arranged in a smiley face. He never missed a parent-teacher conference. He hired a babysitter, Mrs. Chen, who was kind and patient and taught me to make dumplings on Saturday afternoons. He bought me new Lego sets for my birthday, increasingly complex ones as I grew older. The boxes promising medieval villages and pirate ships and entire fantasy kingdoms. What he didn't do, what he couldn't do, perhaps because it wasn't in his nature, or perhaps because he was drowning in his own silent grief, was kneel down and enter the world I was building. He provided the materials, the space, the safety. He gave me the foundation, but he never stepped inside. It started, as these things often do, with small things. I was a Lego architect, a master of imaginary worlds. I'd build these sprawling, colorful castles on the living room floor, each brick placed with the solemn focus of a cathedral builder. And my dad, he'd be right there, on the couch, his laptop glowing on his knees like a tiny, blue altar. I'd finish my masterpiece, my heart pounding with pride, and I'd say, "Daddy, look." He'd say, "That's great, honey," in that warm, automatic voice, his eyes never leaving the screen. The first dozen times I believed him. I thought, "That's great," meant he had seen it, that he understood the narrative I'd constructed. The brave knight in the tower who was actually a scientist inventing a machine to talk to dragons. The spiral staircase I'd engineered to be sturdy enough to support the weight of my small plastic people. The garden I'd built outside the castle walls with green bricks and flowers made from the tiny one. Dot pieces that hurt when you stepped on them barefoot. But by the 13th time, or the 20th, or the 30th, I began to understand. "That's great, honey," didn't mean I see what you've built. It meant I acknowledge that you have built something. The distinction is subtle but devastating to a child whose primary language is creation, whose way of saying "I exist" is "look at what I've made." He didn't see the specific arrangement of the towers, the moat I'd crafted from a blue blanket, the tiny Lego knight I'd positioned to slay the dragon under the coffee table. He saw a generic "good job." He didn't see my world. I learned, very early, that my creations were background noise to the more important, more real world of spreadsheets and emails. I remember one evening in particular, I must have been 6 or 7, when I'd spent the entire afternoon building an elaborate fortress. This wasn't child's play. This was serious architectural endeavor. I'd planned it out on graph paper first, drawing little squares to represent the bricks, counting to make sure I had enough of each color. The fortress had 4 corner towers, each exactly the same height, connected by walls with battlements. Inside the walls, I'd created a courtyard with a well in the center, a stroke of genius involving a cylindrical piece and some creative stacking. There was a throne room, a dungeon, a kitchen, even a small stable for the horses. It had taken me hours. My back ached from hunching over. My fingertips were sore from pressing the bricks together with the intense pressure required to make them lock perfectly. I hadn't eaten the snack Mrs. Chen had left out for me. I'd ignored the doorbell when my friend Mia came by to see if I could play. This castle was important. It was the best thing I'd ever made. "Daddy!" I called out when I'd placed the final flag, a red banner on the highest tower. "Daddy, come look. I finished." He was in his home office, the room that had been my mother's craft studio before she left, now converted into a space of filing cabinets and a large desk with 2 monitors. The door was ajar, and I could hear the clack of his keyboard, that rapid fire typing that meant he was in the zone, composing something important. "I'm a little busy, sweetheart." He called back, "Can you give me 10 minutes? I sat down beside my fortress to wait. 10 minutes was nothing. I'd spent 4 hours building this. I could wait 10 minutes for the unveiling. I used the time to add final touches, adjusting the placement of the guards along the walls, making sure the drawbridge could move up and down smoothly, arranging the citizens in the courtyard as if they were going about their daily medieval business. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. The light outside began to fade, the shadows lengthening across the living room floor. My castle, which had looked so impressive in the bright afternoon sun, began to look smaller, less significant in the dimming light. Finally, after nearly an hour, my father emerged. His hair was rumpled from running his hands through it, a habit he had when he was stressed. His tie was loosened, though he hadn't actually gone into the office that day. He always dressed as if he might need to suddenly appear professional via video call. "Okay, sweetie, let me see what you've been working on," he said, his voice carrying that forced brightness that adults use when they're trying to be present, but their mind is still half in the problem they just left behind. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting, and gestured proudly to my fortress. "I made a castle. See, it has 4 towers and they're all the same height, and there's a courtyard inside with a well, and a drawbridge that really works, and wow, that's really great, honey." He interrupted, his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his eyebrows furrowed. "That's beautiful. You're so creative." His fingers were already moving across his phone screen, typing a response to whatever message had just arrived. "But Dad, look at the—" "I am looking, sweetheart. It's wonderful, really wonderful. You're such a good builder." He was walking backward now toward his office, his eyes still on his phone. "I just need to send this one email, okay? Why don't you come show Mrs. Chen? She'll love it." And he was gone, the office door clicking shut behind him. I stood there in the gathering darkness looking at my castle. It didn't look wonderful anymore. It looked like a pile of plastic bricks, meaningless, arbitrary. The well in the courtyard that had seemed so clever now looked clumsy. The perfectly matched towers looked boring. The entire afternoon of work collapsed into a child's mess on the living room floor. Mrs. Chen did admire it when she came to start dinner. She knelt down, asked me questions about each section, made appropriately impressed noises. But she was paid to be there. Her attention was a service purchased by my father, like the groceries she brought home, like the clean laundry she folded. It wasn't the same. That night, I took apart the castle. Not in anger. I was too young to understand my feelings as anger. I simply disassembled it, brick by brick, sorting the pieces back into their color. Coded containers. If a structure falls in the forest and no one is there to witness it, did it ever really stand? If you build a world and no one enters it, does it exist? This pattern became the wallpaper of my life. Not a dramatic, singular trauma, but a repetitive pattern that wallpapered over my childhood in layer after layer of small invisibilities. Each instance was minor, forgivable, understandable. My father was busy. He was providing for us. He was a single parent doing his best. He showed up. He paid attention in the ways he knew how. He asked about my day at dinner, listened to my one-sentence answers, nodded approvingly at my report cards. What he didn't do was see past the surface. Didn't ask follow-up questions. Didn't notice when my one-sentence answers became evasive, when my good grades shifted from a love of learning to a performance of acceptability. He saw the mask I was constructing and complimented me on its craftsmanship, never thinking to ask what I might be hiding beneath it. In middle school, I discovered I had a talent for arguing. Not the petulant, foot-stomping kind, but the kind where I could take an idea and dissect it, find its logical heart, and present it with a clarity that surprised my teachers. It happened almost by accident. I was in 8th grade social studies, a class taught by Mr. Reeves, a man who'd been teaching for 30 years and had perfected the art of showing historical documentaries while he graded papers at his desk. Most days, the class was a passive experience. We watched grainy footage of wars and social movements, took notes in the dark, occasionally filled out worksheets about what we'd seen. But one day, Mr. Reeves decided to try something different. Maybe he'd been to a professional development workshop on engaging students. Maybe he was just bored of his own routine. Whatever the reason, he announced that we'd be having a class debate on whether the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were morally justified. The class groaned. Debates meant talking in front of everyone, meant the possibility of being wrong publicly, meant disruption of the comfortable anonymity that most middle schoolers crave. But I felt something else, a small spark of interest. Mr. Reeves divided us randomly into 2 groups. I ended up on the not justified side, which initially disappointed me, and my 12-year-old understanding we'd won the war, ended it early, saved lives. That's what the textbook said. That's what seemed obvious. But Mr. Reeves gave us a week to prepare, and something unusual happened to me during that week. I actually did the research, not just the bare minimum to have something to say, but deep research. I went to the public library after school, asked the librarian for help finding books about the decision to use atomic weapons. I discovered there was a huge amount of debate, that historians had been arguing about this for decades, that it wasn't nearly as simple as our textbook made it seem. I learned about the Japanese surrender offers that might have been rejected unnecessarily. I read about the estimates of civilian casualties, not just numbers, but descriptions of individual suffering that made me physically sick to my stomach. I discovered that some of the military leadership at the time had argued against using the bombs, that even the men who'd helped create them had later expressed profound regret. But more than the facts, I discovered something about the architecture of an argument. I learned that a good argument wasn't about yelling the loudest or having the most passion. It was about structure. It was like building with Legos, but with logic instead of bricks. You needed a foundation, the core claim. You needed supporting walls, the evidence. You needed a roof, the conclusion that covered everything and made it coherent. And just like with Legos, every piece had to fit precisely, had to connect to the pieces around it, or the whole structure would be unstable. The day of the debate arrived. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'd written out my entire opening statement on index cards, but my hands were shaking so badly the cards rattled audibly when I stood up. The justified side went first. My classmate Tyler, who I'd never heard string together more than 5 words in class, stood up and read in a monotone from his cards. The atomic bombs were justified because they ended the war quickly and saved American lives. If we had invaded Japan, millions of soldiers would have died. President Truman made the right decision. Thank you. It was underwhelming. There was a smattering of applause, more polite than enthusiastic. Then Mr. Reeves nodded at me. I stood up, and for the first few seconds, I thought I might actually vomit from nerves. The classroom felt too hot. Everyone was looking at me. I could see my friend Jessica giving me an encouraging smile, and somehow that made it worse. It reminded me how much there was to lose if I failed. But then I looked down at my first index card, took a breath, and something shifted. The nervousness didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Energy, focus. My voice, when I started speaking, was quiet and shaky, but it was mine. Tyler argues that the bombs saved lives, and that's what we've always been told. But I want us to think about whose lives we're counting and whether we're doing the math honestly. I went on. I talked about the fact that Japan was already devastated by conventional bombing, that their navy was destroyed, their cities in ruins. I presented the evidence that they'd been putting out surrender feelers through neutral countries. I quoted military leaders, Admiral Leahy, General Eisenhower, who'd said the bombs were unnecessary. I described, in age-appropriate but unflinching terms, what happens to human bodies at the epicenter of an atomic blast, what happened to the children in those cities. But I didn't just present facts. I constructed an argument. I showed how each piece of evidence connected to the next, how they built toward an inevitable conclusion. I anticipated counterarguments. What about Pearl Harbor? What about the American lives that would be lost in an invasion? And I addressed them directly, showing why they didn't actually support the opposite position. When I finished, the classroom was silent. Not the awkward silence of boredom, but the charged silence of people whose minds have just been engaged. Then Jessica started clapping, and others joined in, and it wasn't the polite smattering that Tyler had received. It was real applause. Mr. Reeves was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen from a teacher before. It wasn't just approval. It was surprise, tinged with something like respect. That was. He paused, searching for words. That was genuinely impressive. Has anyone else noticed that she didn't just list facts? She built an actual argument with structure and logic and rhetoric. Where did you learn to do that? I shrugged, suddenly shy again now that the performance was over. I don't know. I built it like you build anything, one piece at a time. After class, Mr. Reeves asked me to stay behind. Have you ever considered joining the debate team? He asked. I hadn't. I barely knew we had a debate team. It existed in the same peripheral awareness as other extracurriculars I'd never considered joining. Things that required putting yourself forward, demanding attention, taking up space. I don't think I'd be any good at it, I said, defaulting to the self-deprecation that had become my automatic response. You're joking, right? Mr. Reeves laughed. What you just did, that's what debate is, and you're a natural. At least come to one practice. If you hate it, you never have to come back. I did go to one practice, and then another, and then I was on the team. Debate became my obsession. It was everything I'd been looking for without knowing I was searching. It was building, like my childhood Lego castles, but the structures were made of words and logic instead of plastic bricks. It was performance, but with rules and structure that made the performance feel safe. And most importantly, it forced people to listen. When you stand at a podium in a debate round, your opponent has to sit there and hear every word you say. They can rebut you, but they can't ignore you. They can't say, "That's nice, honey," without looking at you. They have to engage with your world. I discovered I was good at it, not just competent, but genuinely talented. I could think on my feet, adapt my arguments in real time based on what my opponents said. I could spot logical fallacies like a birdwatcher identifying species. There's the ad hominem, there's the slippery slope, there's the false dilemma. I learned to love the intellectual combat of it, the way a good round felt like a chess game played with words. More than that, I discovered that I had a voice, not just literally, though my voice did grow stronger and more confident as I practiced, but metaphorically. I had things to say, perspectives to offer, arguments to make. And in the structured world of debate, those things mattered. They were evaluated based on their merit, their logic, their evidence, not on whether I was convenient or easy or quiet. My coaches, Mrs. Patel and Mr. Kim, were the opposite of my father in every way that mattered. They paid attention not just to the outcome, whether I won or lost, but to the how and why. After every practice round, they'd give detailed feedback. That second contention was strong, but you need more recent evidence for the economic impact claim. Your rebuttal was excellent. You turned their argument against them beautifully. Work on your vocal variety in the introduction. You want to hook the judge in the first 15 seconds. They saw me, not a generic version of a successful student, but the specific contours of my particular mind. They could identify my strengths, my ability to synthesize complex information quickly, my talent for finding the fatal flaw in an opponent's logic, and my weaknesses, my tendency to over-prepare and then stick too rigidly to my prepared script, my difficulty with the more theatrical aspects of performance. I soaked up their attention like a plant that had been grown in dim light, suddenly moved to a sunny window. I stayed after practice to ask questions, came early to help set up, spent hours in the library researching cases. My bedroom walls, once decorated with posters of boy bands and movies, became covered with evidence cards, argument outlines, quotes from philosophers and economists and scientists. For the first time in my life since my mother left, I felt like I was building something that mattered in a space where my building was noticed. My father approved of debate in his abstract way. It was a good activity. It would look good on college applications. He liked that I was passionate about something, the same way he might like a garden without particularly caring about the individual flowers. When I made the varsity team as a freshman, almost unheard of in our school's competitive program, he took me out to dinner to celebrate. We went to an Applebee's and he ordered my favorite dessert, the chocolate lava cake, without me even asking. He toasted me with his beer and my Sprite, told me he was proud of me. So explained to me again how this whole debate thing works. He said, cutting into his steak, "You argue about politics." I'd explained it to him before, multiple times, but I explained it again. The structure of a debate round, the different types of arguments, how judges evaluate the rounds based on logic and evidence rather than just opinion. I told him about the topic we were preparing for nationals, something about nuclear weapons policy. and why it was intellectually fascinating. He nodded along, asked a few surface-level questions, complimented my intelligence. But I could see his eyes glazing over slightly when I got into the specific details about the case I was running, about the philosophical framework I was using. It wasn't malicious. He was genuinely trying to understand. But it was clear that the nuances of debate theory weren't particularly interesting to him. "Well, it's great that you've found something you're good at," he concluded, signaling for the check. "Just don't let it interfere with your grades, okay? Debate is fine, but academics come first." This annoyed me, though I couldn't quite articulate why at the time. Debate wasn't separate from academics. It was arguably more educational than half my classes. The research skills, the critical thinking, the public speaking, these were academic in the deepest sense. But to him, it was an extracurricular, a hobby, something that was valuable only insofar as it served the real goal of getting into a good college. But I didn't argue. I said, "Of course, Dad, academics first." And we finished our dessert and went home. Still, I had debate. I had Mrs. Patel and Mr. Kim. I had my teammates, who understood the obsessive drive to perfect an argument, who spoke the same language I was learning. I had judges who evaluated me based on the content of my speech rather than whether I was pleasant or convenient. For 3 years of high school, this was enough. The state championship was a big deal. Our school had never won. We'd placed a few times, but never taken the top trophy. My partner, a senior named Marcus, who'd been doing debate since middle school, and I had a legitimate shot. We'd won every tournament that semester. Our case was airtight, our rebuttals were sharp, and we worked together with the kind of synergy that made us greater than the sum of our parts. The topic was the ethics of artificial intelligence, and I was arguing for a moratorium on certain types of military AI. I'd spent weeks researching, preparing, losing sleep. I'd read everything from technical papers on machine learning to philosophical treatises on moral agency. I'd watched documentaries about drone warfare, read testimony from veterans about the psychological impact of remote killing, studied case after case of algorithmic bias and unintended consequences. This wasn't just a debate case to me. It was a mission. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just an interesting intellectual exercise. It was genuinely important. The decisions we made now about AI and warfare would shape the future in profound ways. And I wanted to be part of that conversation. My father knew about the championship, of course. It was marked on the family calendar that hung on our refrigerator, the one where we coordinated schedules and appointments. As the date approached, I mentioned it at dinner a few times, maybe more often than necessary, making sure he remembered. "The state championship is this Saturday." I'd say, trying to sound casual, "I know, sweetheart. It's on the calendar. It starts at 9 in the morning. It'll probably run until late afternoon. I'll be there," he'd assure me, but there was always a small knot of anxiety in my stomach. He'd missed a few tournaments over the years. Work emergencies, last-minute travel, things that were legitimately beyond his control. He'd always apologized profusely, always made it clear that missing it was a genuine disappointment for him. And he'd attended more than he'd missed. By any objective measure, he was a present parent, but presence and witness are different things. He'd been to tournaments before, sat in the audience during my rounds, clapped when I won. But I always had the sense that he was there to observe the outcome, not to understand the process. He couldn't tell you the difference between a good round and a bad round beyond whether I'd won or lost. He didn't understand what made a particular argument elegant, what made a rebuttal devastating, what separated a competent debater from an excellent one. The morning of the championship, I woke up at 6 a.m., even though my alarm was set for 7. My stomach was a tight ball of nerves and excitement. I went through my pre-tournament ritual: shower, carefully chosen power outfit, black pants, red blouse. Red for confidence, Mrs. Patel had once told me light breakfast that wouldn't make me nauseous review of key evidence cards. My father was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. He was dressed casually, jeans and a button-down shirt, which was his weekend uniform. "Big day," he said, smiling at me. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," I admitted, "but good." "Ready?" "You're going to do great." He poured me a cup of coffee. I'd started drinking it that year, claiming it helped me think more clearly, though mostly I just liked feeling grown up. "What time do we need to leave?" "8:30. It's about a 40-minute drive to the venue." He nodded, glancing at his watch. "Plenty of time." We arrived at the convention center where the championship was being held at 9:15. The parking lot was already packed with cars bearing school bumper stickers from across the state. Competitors streamed toward the entrance, carrying plastic bins of evidence cards, rolling briefcases, wearing various interpretations of professional attire. Inside, the main hall was controlled chaos. Dozens of schools had set up camp in different sections, their team names on handmade signs. Students clustered around coaches reviewing last-minute strategy. The air buzzed with nervous energy and the particular vocabulary of debate, cross-sex strategy, turn their impacts, extend through the flow. I found Mrs. Patel and the rest of my team near the check-in desk. My father hung back, looking slightly uncomfortable in this world he didn't quite understand. Mrs. Patel gave me a quick hug, handed me my ballot assignment, reviewed the bracket with me. I was debating in the third round of preliminaries first. "Your dad's here," Mrs. Patel said, noticing him hovering nearby. "Mr. Harrison, great to see you. She's going to be fantastic today." My father smiled, shook her hand. "I'm sure she will be. She's been working incredibly hard. She's one of the best debaters I've coached in 15 years. Mrs. Patel said, and the pride in her voice made my chest tight. "Her case construction is sophisticated beyond her years. You should be very proud." "I am," my father said, and he sounded like he meant it. The first two preliminary rounds were in the morning. I won both, though the second one was close. My opponent was brilliant, a junior from a school known for their debate program, and she nearly caught me in a logical inconsistency during cross-examination. But I recovered, rebuilt my argument, and pulled out the win. Between rounds, there were long stretches of waiting. Debate tournaments are marathons of hurry up and wait. You prepare frantically, debate intensely for an hour, then sit around for 2 hours waiting for the next round while judges deliberate and ballots are processed. My father tried his best during the waiting periods. He bought me lunch from the concession stand, a sad sandwich and chips that I mostly couldn't eat because my stomach was too knotted with adrenaline. He asked how the rounds went, listened to my brief summaries, told me I was doing great. But I could see him glancing at his phone frequently, typing out emails during the long stretches, taking calls outside in the hallway. I told myself it didn't matter. He was here. That's what counted. By late afternoon, Marcus and I had made it to the final round. We were debating against a team from a prestigious private school in the state capital, 2 seniors who'd been debating together for 3 years. They were good, polished, confident, their arguments sharp and well researched. The final round was held in the main auditorium, with a panel of 3 judges instead of the usual one, and an audience of coaches, parents, and eliminated competitors who'd stayed to watch. The room was packed, the energy electric. I was 14, scrawny, my voice still prone to cracking with nerves. I'd worn my lucky earrings, small silver studs my mother had given me before she left, one of the few pieces of her jewelry I still had. I touched them now, a talisman, as Marcus and I set up our materials at the affirmative table. The topic was the ethics of artificial intelligence, and I was arguing for a moratorium on certain types of military AI. My opponent was a senior from a rival school, all confidence and slicked back hair, a boy named Jonathan who had the kind of casual arrogance that comes from never having been seriously challenged. But I was prepared. I'd practiced this case dozens of times, I knew every argument, every piece of evidence, every possible objection, and how to answer it. The round began. Jonathan's opening statement was strong. He argued that autonomous weapons systems could actually reduce civilian casualties by being more precise than human soldiers, that a moratorium would put us at a strategic disadvantage against adversaries who wouldn't abide by it, that the technology was inevitable and we needed to lead its development to ensure it was used ethically. But I'd anticipated all of this. When it was my turn, I stood up, and despite my nerves, my voice was steady. I began with a philosophical question. What does it mean to delegate the decision to kill to a machine that can't understand the moral weight of that decision? I walked the judges through the argument carefully. Autonomous weapons systems, I explained, make targeting decisions based on algorithms and pattern recognition. But they can't understand context, can't weigh the moral dimensions of a choice, can't be held accountable in any meaningful sense. I presented evidence of algorithmic biospatial recognition systems that misidentify people of color at much higher rates, predictive policing algorithms that reinforce existing patterns of discrimination. If we can't create algorithms that fairly predict crime or correctly identify faces, I argued, how can we trust them with decisions about who lives and who dies? I addressed the strategic argument directly. My opponent argues that we need to develop these weapons or we'll fall behind. But this is the same logic that drove the nuclear arms race, and we're still living with the consequences of that choice. The fact that something is possible doesn't mean we should do it. The fact that others might, it doesn't absolve us of our moral responsibility to refuse. But the turning point came during cross-examination. Jonathan had made an argument about precision, that autonomous systems, because they're not affected by fear or anger or fatigue, could actually be more ethical than human soldiers in their targeting decisions. During cross-ex, I asked him, you argue that AI systems are more precise, but precise at what? What exactly are they optimizing for? He answered confidently, minimizing civilian casualties while achieving military objectives. But who defines those military objectives? Who decides which civilians are acceptable losses in pursuit of those objectives? An algorithm can optimize for a goal, but it can't question whether the goal itself is moral. It can't exercise judgment in the way a human soldier might when faced with an order that seems wrong. I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the moment when he realized his argument had a flaw. Human soldiers make mistakes too. He countered, but it was a weak response, defensive rather than assertive. They do, I agreed. But human soldiers can also refuse illegal orders. They can feel remorse. They can be held accountable. They bear the moral weight of their actions in a way that a machine never can. When we delegate the decision to kill to an algorithm, we're not just making warfare more efficient. We're fundamentally changing its moral character. We're creating a world where killing can be done without anyone feeling responsible for it, and that should terrify us. The room was silent. I could feel the attention of everyone present, that electric moment when an argument lands with full force. When they announced my name as the winner, the rush was indescribable. It was a validation I'd been starving for, not just that I'd won, but that my ideas had won. The argument I'd built, the logic I'd constructed, the careful architecture of reasoning and evidence, it had proven superior. I'd been heard, understood, evaluated on merit, and found worthy. Marcus was hugging me, Mrs. Patel was crying, my teammates were cheering. The trophy was heavy in my hands, the cheap gold plastic somehow precious. I stood on that stage, the cheap gold ribbon in my hand, the applause washing over me. I scanned the audience, and there he was, my dad. He'd made it. He was in the 4th row, standing with the other parents, clapping. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes. For a moment, I felt complete I'd built something magnificent, and he was here to witness it. He was clapping, a small, polite smile on his face. And then, as I met his eyes across the auditorium, he gave me a thumbs up with one hand, our signal, the one he'd used since I was little, meaning good job. I'm proud of you." And with the other, he brought his phone to his ear. I saw his lips move, saw him hold up one finger to someone nearby in an apologetic gesture, watched him turn slightly away, his hand coming up to his other ear to block out the noise of the auditorium. "Yeah, I'm here," his lips said, and though I couldn't hear him over the applause, I could read the words, "Go ahead with the Q3 numbers." In that moment, the applause vanished. The sound didn't physically stop. People were still clapping, Mrs. Patel was still wiping her eyes, Marcus was still celebrating. But in my subjective experience, it all went silent. The world narrowed to that single image, my father, present but not present, there but not there, witnessing the outcome but utterly absent from the meaning. The trophy in my hand felt like lead. The ribbon around my neck felt like it was choking me. The victory, the intellectual high, the 3 years of work that had led to this moment. It all crumbled into dust. He was there, but he wasn't present. He saw me win, but he didn't see how I won. He didn't see the strategy, the fear I'd conquered, the precise moment I turned the debate. He saw an outcome, a check mark on a list of good parenting duties, attend daughters competition. The content, the substance of my being, was once again irrelevant. The rest of the awards ceremony passed in a blur. I accepted congratulations from judges, shook hands with my opponents, smiled for photos. I functioned on autopilot, playing the role of the gracious winner while inside, something fundamental was collapsing. When it was finally over, when the awards ceremony had concluded and people were starting to pack up and leave, my father appeared beside me. He'd put his phone away, his attention now fully on me. "Congratulations, sweetie. That was amazing." He pulled me into a hug, and I let myself be hugged, my arms hanging limply at my sides. "I'm so proud of you. State champion. Wait until we tell everyone." "Thanks, Dad," I said, my voice hollow. If he noticed my lack of enthusiasm, he didn't comment on it. "We should celebrate. Where do you want to go for dinner? Your choice, anywhere you want." "I'm really tired," I said, which was true. I was exhausted, but not in the way he thought. "Can we just go home?" Of course, it's been a long day." He grabbed my bag, carried my bin of evidence cards, walked me to the car with his hand on my shoulder, the proud father with his accomplished daughter. In the car on the drive home, he asked me about the final round. "So what was the big argument that won it for you?" I could have explained. I could have walked him through the philosophical framework, the cross-examination strategy, the specific moment when I found the flaw in Jonathan's logic. I could have shared what I discovered about the ethics of delegating moral decisions to machines, why it mattered, why I'd spent weeks researching and thinking about it. Instead, I said, "I just argued my points well." The judges agreed with me. "Well, you've always been good at arguing," he said with a laugh. "Even when you were little, you could always make a case for why you should get extra dessert or stay up late. I guess it was good training." He meant it as a compliment, a callback to shared memories. But reducing what I just accomplished, the intellectual rigor, the moral reasoning, the carefully constructed argument, to arguing for extra dessert, felt like another erasure. My debate wasn't serious intellectual work. It was just a more sophisticated version of a child's negotiation tactics. I didn't correct him. I just looked out the window at the passing streetlights and said nothing. That was the first major fracture. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. It was a hairline crack, deep in the foundation of my sense of self. If my greatest triumphs were just background noise, if even when he was physically present, he couldn't truly witness what I was doing, then what was the point of the effort? What was the point of me? I kept the trophy on my bookshelf, but I never looked at it without remembering that phone call. Years later, when I was packing for college, I almost threw it away. In the end, I buried it at the bottom of a box of childhood mementos, things I couldn't quite discard but didn't want to display. So, I did what any rational organism does when it's injured. I retreated. I built a shell. I became the easy daughter. The transformation wasn't conscious or deliberate. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to become someone else. It was more organic than that, a gradual adaptation to my environment. The same way a plant grows toward light or an animal develops camouflage to survive in its habitat. I noticed that when I needed things, help with homework, a ride to a friend's house, money for a school trip, my father responded better when I presented those needs efficiently, not with emotion or urgency or context, but as simple, solvable problems. Dad, I need $40 for the field trip by Friday. Dad, can you drive me to Sarah's house at 3 p.m.? These requests got immediate, positive responses. They fit into his framework of parenting as problem solving. But when I tried to share things that weren't problems requiring solutions, an interesting idea from English class, a conflict with a friend, confusion about something I'd read, his attention would drift. He'd listen for a minute or two, then his responses would become generic. That's interesting. I'm sure you'll figure it out. What does your teacher say? So I stopped sharing those things. I learned to separate my needs into two categories: logistical shareable and emotional private. The logistical needs were met promptly and efficiently. The emotional needs I learned to handle on my own. I became the one who got good grades, who didn't cause trouble, who was so mature for her age. What a tragic phrase that is, mature for her age. It's just a polite way of saying a child has learned to bury their needs so deep that they no longer inconvenience the adults around them. Adults would say it to my father at parent-teacher conferences, at school events, at family gatherings. She's so mature for her age. She's so independent. She's no trouble at all. And my father would beam with pride, accepting these compliments as evidence of his successful parenting, never questioning what it cost me to earn them. The truth is that I wasn't mature, I was compressed. I'd learned to make myself smaller, quieter, less demanding of space and attention. I'd learned that my value lay in my ability to function smoothly within the system, not to challenge it or complicate it or require special accommodation. I stopped building Lego castles. At some point during middle school, I'd packed them all away in plastic bins in the basement, telling myself I was too old for toys. But it wasn't about age. I'd simply internalized the lesson that creating things for the joy of creation, building worlds that existed only in imagination, was a childish indulgence. If a creation didn't serve a practical purpose, if it didn't result in a grade or a trophy or some external validation, it wasn't worth the effort. I stopped showing him my debate cases. I'd still practice, still refine my arguments, still do the work. But I stopped trying to explain the nuances to him, stopped hoping he'd understand the elegance of a particular logical structure, or appreciate the cleverness of a strategic choice. When he'd ask how debate was going, I'd say, fine, and leave it at that. I performed the role of a happy, successful daughter, and I did it so well that he never had a reason to look up from his screen. My report cards were excellent. I was accepted into the National Honor Society. I won more debate tournaments. I had friends, not many, but enough to prove I was well-adjusted. I volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, not because I particularly loved it, but because it looked good on college applications and gave me a legitimate reason to be out of the house. To any outside observer, I was thriving. I was exactly the kind of daughter every parent hopes for self. Sufficient, accomplished, headed for success. But the breaking wasn't finished. It had just gone underground. The silence in which my breaks were happening became internal. It was the silence of not asking for help with my homework, even when I was struggling with calculus. I'd spend hours on problem sets, teaching myself from YouTube videos and online forums, sometimes getting answers wrong because I'd misunderstood a fundamental concept. My father, who had a degree in engineering and could have easily helped me, was in the next room. But asking for help would mean admitting struggle, would mean being trouble, would mean risking that distracted "I'm busy right now, can't you figure it out yourself?" that I'd learned to dread. It was the silence of not telling him when I got my heart broken for the first time by a boy who thought my intelligence was intimidating. I was 16 and I'd liked Noah for months before finally getting the courage to tell him. We'd been lab partners in chemistry, and I'd loved the way he laughed at my jokes, the way he'd ask my opinion on complex problems, the way he seemed genuinely interested in my ideas. When I finally confessed my feelings after school one day, his face had gone through a complex series of expressions: surprise, consideration, discomfort. "You're really smart," he'd said slowly, "and that's cool and everything, but I don't know, you're kind of intimidating, like dating you would be. Intense. I think we're better as friends." I'd held it together until I got home, then cried in my room for 2 hours. My father knocked once, asked if I was okay. "I'm fine, just stressed about a test." I'd called through the door. He'd accepted this explanation, told me not to study too hard, went back to whatever he was doing. I couldn't tell him the truth. That a boy I liked had essentially said I was too much. That my intelligence, the thing I'd worked so hard to develop, the thing that earned praise from teachers and trophies from competitions, was a flaw in the context of romantic desirability. I couldn't talk about the confusion of being told to excel academically while simultaneously learning that excellence could make you unlovable. These were complex, messy emotional problems, and I'd learned that my father didn't have the tools or the time for those. It was the silence of sitting at the dinner table, talking about the weather or current events or his work or my classes, while inside, a storm of existential questions was raging. Who was I, if not the reflection in his disinterested eyes? What did it mean that I could excel at everything I attempted and still feel fundamentally unseen? Was there something wrong with me that I needed more than what he was giving, when objectively, he was a good parent who met all my needs? I'd read books about girls with terrible fathers, abusive, absent, addicted. My father wasn't any of those things. He was present, sober, kind. He provided for me materially and emotionally in the ways he understood those things. So why did I feel so lonely in his presence? Why did I feel like I was performing my life rather than living it? The worst part was that I couldn't articulate what was missing. If someone had asked me, "What do you need from your father?" I wouldn't have known how to answer. More attention. He attended my school events. More support. He supported my activities, paid for my debate travel, bought my books. More love. He told me he loved me, hugged me good night, remembered my birthday. What I needed was something I didn't have words for yet. To be witnessed. Not observed, not monitored, not evaluated, but truly seen. To have someone enter my world instead of waiting for me to translate my world into terms they could understand from the outside. To have someone curious about not just what I was doing, but how I was experiencing what I was doing, what it meant to me, who I was becoming in the process. But I didn't know how to ask for that, and he didn't know how to offer it. So the silence between us grew, comfortable and familiar and utterly impenetrable. This internal pressure had to go somewhere. In Western culture, we're taught from a young age that our value is tied to our productivity, our achievements, our curated individuality. We are the captains of our own souls, the makers of our own destiny. It's a powerful, empowering narrative. The self-made person, the individual who pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, who overcomes obstacles through sheer force of will and character. It's the American dream repackaged for every generation. Work hard, be smart, make good choices, and you'll succeed. Your life is your own creation, a product of your decisions and efforts. But it has a dark, shadow side. If you are failing, if you are breaking, it is entirely and utterly your own fault. There is no room for structural cracks, for the subtle erosion caused by a fundamental lack of witness, for the ways that emotional neglect can be just as damaging as active harm. If you're suffering despite having all your material needs met, despite having opportunities and support and a parent who loves you, then the problem must be you. You're ungrateful, you're oversensitive, you're making mountains out of molehills. So when I started to crumble in college, I blamed only myself. I'd chosen philosophy, much to my father's quiet confusion. "What will you do with that?" He'd asked, not unkindly, just pragmatically, when I'd told him my intended major during the spring of my senior year of high school. It was a fair question, I suppose. Philosophy doesn't lead to an obvious career path the way engineering or nursing or business does. But I couldn't explain to him that I wasn't choosing philosophy for career reasons. I was choosing it because I was trying to find a language for the silence, because I was digging through centuries of human thought looking for someone, anyone, who could describe the specific ache of being unseen. I'd read some philosophy in high school, Plato's Republic for a class, some Nietzsche on my own because I'd heard it was edgy and rebellious. But I hadn't really understood what philosophy was until I took an introductory course my senior year taught by a visiting lecturer from the local university. Philosophy, I discovered, was the art of asking the questions that everyone else took for granted. Why do we believe what we believe? How do we know what we know? What makes an action moral? What makes a life meaningful? What does it mean to be a person, to have consciousness, to exist in relation to others? These were the questions that had been rattling around in my head for years, unarticulated and inchoate. Philosophy gave me a framework for thinking about them, a vocabulary for naming them, a tradition of brilliant minds who'd grappled with them before me. So I went to a good liberal arts college 3 hours away from home, far enough to feel independent, but close enough that I could come home for holidays. And I declared philosophy as my major by the end of my first semester. College was both liberating and disorienting. For the first time in my life, I was living in a community of people who valued ideas for their own sake, who would stay up until 3 in the morning debating the ethics of effective altruism or the metaphysics of personal identity. My professors were intellectually generous, treating my questions and arguments with the seriousness they deserved, pushing me to think deeper and more rigorously. But I also felt adrift in a way I hadn't anticipated. High school had structure. Classes, debate practice, homework, a clear set of expectations and metrics for success. College had structure too, but it was looser, more self-directed. You had to choose your own path, construct your own meaning, figure out who you were becoming without a script to follow, and without the constant pressure of performance, without debate tournaments to win, without my father's subtle approval to earn. I started to unravel. It started small. I'd miss a class here or there, not because I was sick or had somewhere else to be, but because I just couldn't get out of bed. The depression, though I didn't name it as depression yet, wasn't dramatic. I wasn't suicidal, wasn't self-harming, wasn't having panic attacks. I was just flat, going through the motions, doing the work because that's what you do, but feeling no real connection to it. I'd sit in my philosophy seminars, listening to discussions about consciousness and free will and the nature of the self, and I'd think, these are the most important questions in the world, and I feel nothing. I'd read Kant or Hume or Sartre and understand the arguments intellectually, but they didn't touch me emotionally the way they once had. Food became something I sometimes forgot to eat, not because I was trying to lose weight or had an eating disorder, but because eating required a level of engagement with my physical existence that felt exhausting. My roommate, a sweet pre-med student named Alicia, would bring me snacks from the dining hall, leave them on my desk with little notes. Eat something. I maintained my grades. That ingrained habit of achievement was too deep to break, but it was mechanical. I'd write papers at the last minute, churn out A-level work not because I cared about it, but because I didn't know how to do otherwise. My professors would write comments like excellent analysis and sophisticated argument, and I'd feel nothing. The validation that had once mattered so much now seemed hollow. I called home once a week, every Sunday evening, like a dutiful daughter. My father would ask how classes were going, and I'd say fine. He'd tell me about work, about the neighbors, about mundane details of his life. We'd talk for 15 minutes, say we loved each other, hang up. After those calls, I'd feel more alone than I had before. I made friends, but I kept them at arm's length. I'd perfected the art of seeming close while revealing nothing substantive. I could be fun at parties, engaging in class discussions, a good listener when others wanted to talk about their problems. But I never let anyone see the emptiness inside, the sense that I was performing the role of college student having a meaningful experience, while my actual self was somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. The breaking point came during the spring semester of my sophomore year. I was taking a seminar on existentialism taught by Professor Chen, a brilliant woman with kind eyes and a sharp intellect who'd written several well-regarded books on phenomenology. It was in that seminar, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in March, that the final critical fracture occurred. We were discussing Camus and the concept of the absurd, the futile search for meaning in a meaningless universe. I'd read The Myth of Sisyphus over spring break, sitting in my childhood bedroom at home while my father worked in his office down the hall. Camus's description of Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the mountain, only to watch it roll back down, then pushing it up again in an eternal cycle. It had resonated with me in a way that was almost painful. In the seminar, Professor Chen was walking us through Camus's argument. The absurd, she said, pacing in front of the whiteboard where she'd written key quotes, arises from the confrontation between the human need for meaning and the silent, unreasonable world. We want the universe to make sense. We want our suffering to be for something. We want connection, clarity, purpose. But the universe doesn't provide these things. It simply is indifferent to our desires. She paused, looking around the seminar table at the 12 of us. Camus says, the absurd is born of this collision between the human need for clarity and the unreasonable silence of the world. The unreasonable silence of the world. It felt like a physical blow, like someone had reached into my chest and touched the exact spot that had been aching for years. The room seemed to tilt, my vision blurred. I heard someone gasp and realized it was me. That was it. That was the phrase I'd been looking for. The unreasonable silence of the world. It wasn't that my father was malicious. It wasn't that he didn't love me. It wasn't even that he was particularly neglectful by conventional standards. He was a good man, a provider, a responsible parent. He loved me in the abstract way one loves a concept. He wanted me to be happy and successful, would have been devastated if something bad happened to me, took pride in my accomplishments. But his world was silent to mine. His world was reasonable: work, bills, responsibilities, measurable outcomes, practical concerns. My world, my internal world of need and meaning and questions, and a desperate desire to be seen in my specificity. Not as a generic successful daughter, but as me. This particular person with this particular inner life was unreasonable to him. It didn't fit into his framework. It was noise he couldn't parse, a frequency he couldn't hear. And in that collision between my need for witness and his inability to provide it, I was the one who was shattering. Ms. Harrison, Professor Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face in the middle of the seminar, my classmates staring at me with concern and confusion. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm sorry, I need to. I didn't finish the sentence. I grabbed my bag and left, walking quickly out of the seminar room, down the hallway, out of the building. I walked across campus in a daze. The world looked different, like I was seeing it through water. The students laughing on the quad, the professors hurrying to their offices, the gray sky threatening rain. It all felt like a set piece, a backdrop for a play I wasn't acting in anymore. I got to my dorm, climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my room. The elevator felt too small, too confining, unlocked the door. Alicia wasn't there. She had organic chemistry lab on Tuesday afternoons. The room was quiet, my bed unmade, my desk covered with books and papers. I closed the door, slid to the floor with my back against it, and let myself break. I cried for the Lego castles, for all those afternoons of careful construction that no one really saw. I cried for the debate ribbon, for standing on that stage, feeling the world's most profound loneliness in the middle of applause. I cried for all the words I'd swallowed, all the feelings I'd compacted into a tiny, hard ball in my chest, all the times I'd made myself small and easy and undemanding. I cried for the little girl who had tried so hard to be noticeable and had finally given up, who had learned to perform happiness and success while her actual self retreated further and further into the shadows. I cried for the teenager who had learned that even your greatest triumphs can be background noise to someone who loves you. I cried for the young woman I was now, who had everything she was supposed to want: good education, bright future, loving father, and still felt fundamentally alone. This wasn't a quiet, internal break anymore. This wasn't the careful compression of feelings, the strategic retreat, the constructed mask. This was a total systemic collapse. I was sobbing, my body shaking, feeling utterly, completely alone in a universe that had just been officially declared silent and absurd. How long I cried, I don't know. Long enough that my throat was raw, my eyes were swollen, my head was pounding. Long enough that the light outside changed from gray afternoon to the deeper gray of early evening. Long enough that I was surrounded by a pile of damp tissues, that my back ached from sitting on the hard floor, that the storm of emotion had finally exhausted itself. And then, in the aftermath, something shifted. The tears stopped not from exhaustion, though I was exhausted, but from a sudden, stark clarity. The sobs subsided and I was left in a puddle of tear-soaked tissues, but my mind was terrifyingly calm, almost preternaturally clear. I looked around my messy dorm room, at the open copy of Camus on my desk, at the philosophy papers pinned to my bulletin board, at the framed photo of my father and me from my high school graduation. Both of us smiling, his arm around my shoulders, looking for all the world like a happy family. And I had a thought so simple, it was revolutionary. He didn't even notice I was breaking, but I did. I noticed. I was the sole witness to my own destruction. And if I was the witness, then I was also the only one who could be the architect of my reconstruction. This realization wasn't immediately comforting. In fact, it was terrifying. It meant accepting a fundamental loneliness. That no one else could do this for me. That I couldn't wait for my father to suddenly develop the capacity to see me the way I needed to be seen. That I couldn't outsource the work of becoming whole to anyone else. But it was also, strangely, empowering. This is where the Western narrative of individualism, for all its flaws, can be reclaimed and weaponized for empowerment. I was the captain of this soul, not because I was inherently powerful or special or destined for greatness, but because there was no one else on the bridge. The silence wasn't a verdict on my worth. It was a condition of my environment. And conditions can be worked with. You can build in the desert. You can sail on a silent sea. I didn't have an instant recovery. There was no montage of self-improvement set to inspiring music. The work of healing was slow, tedious, sometimes boring, frequently frustrating. But I started making different choices, taking different actions, building different structures. First, I went to the campus counseling center. This itself was a radical act for me admitting that I needed help, that I couldn't figure everything out on my own through sheer intellectual effort. The counselor I was assigned, a woman named Dr. Martinez, was patient and perceptive. She helped me name things I'd never had words for. It sounds like you experienced emotional neglect. She said during our third session, after I told her the story of the Lego castles and the debate championship and the general pattern of my childhood. But he wasn't neglectful. I protested. He was there. He provided for me. He came to my events. He wasn't absent. There are different kinds of absence, Dr. Martinez said gently. Physical absence is the most obvious, but emotional absence can be just as damaging. When a parent is physically present but emotionally unavailable, when they meet your practical needs but not your emotional ones, when they see your achievements but not your inner life, that's a form of neglect. It's just harder to name because it's an absence of something, not a presence of something harmful. This reframing changed everything. I'd spent years thinking that if my suffering wasn't justified by obvious abuse or neglect, then it was my fault, a failure of gratitude or resilience on my part. Naming emotional neglect as a real thing, something that could cause real damage even in the absence of obvious malice, released me from the burden of that self-blame. Second, I started therapy beyond the counseling center's limited sessions. I found a therapist in town, paid for partly by my father's insurance and partly with money I made from work. Study. Dr. Okonkwo was a PhD in clinical psychology who specialized in attachment and family systems. With her, I began the long work of understanding how my childhood had shaped me, how the patterns I'd learned, make yourself small, perform happiness, don't ask for too much, were adaptations to a specific environment but didn't have to define me forever. Third, I started to build again, but this time for an audience of one, me. I began writing, not academic papers for grades, but personal essays, journal entries, attempts to capture my experience in words. Writing became a way of witnessing myself, of paying attention to my own inner life with the scrutiny I'd always wished someone else would apply. I wrote philosophy essays not for a grade, but to untangle the knots in my own mind. I worked through questions that mattered to me. What does it mean to exist in relation to others? How do we form our sense of self? What is the relationship between visibility and identity? Can you exist fully if you're not perceived? What do we owe to each other in terms of attention and recognition? These weren't just abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were personal, urgent, tied to my lived experience in a way that made them feel vital. I started running, not training for anything, not trying to achieve a certain body or hit specific targets, but just moving through space, feeling the strength in my own limbs, being present in my physical self. I'd run along the trails behind campus, through the woods where the light filtered green through leaves. And for those 45 minutes or hour, I'd be completely present in my body, aware of my breath and heartbeat and the rhythm of my feet on the path. Running taught me something important that